Because in uncertain times where there is raised risk at every level, the Rabobank view is that New Zealand farm businesses should be prepared for 25% falls in commodity prices, 15% falls in production, a 2 to 3% increase in interest rates, or a combination of all of the above in order for you to manage your individual businesses. And that we should be prepared for at least two significant events to occur over a 2 to 3 year period. What that says then is that the financial stability of farm businesses and sustainability financially is really important. And what it means is that cash and generation of cash surpluses is critical, and that strong balance sheets are absolutely vital. I can tell you, as an apple grower myself, and as someone who spent a lifetime in the horticultural industry, that that's been incredibly difficult to do, and that the problems inherently with the apple industry is the apple industry has lived for the last 5 years at least on eating individual growers' capital, and that cannot continue. And there are already signs that some of the stresses in the industry are causing businesses to fail, and I suspect there are perhaps more still to come. But if you want a graphic illustration of part of the domestic problem that we see in New Zealand, not out of control, but significant, is the graph on the right is the growth in agricultural debt or credit advance to the agricultural sector over that 20-year period. Doubled in the decade between 1998 and 2008. It did not double revenue, the industry, and it certainly did not double profit or cash surplus. What it tells you is the industry is more highly leveraged as an industry, so this is agriculture generally, than I think is probably wise or sustainable given the inherent risks attached to the industry. And I don't know whether you can pick out the bars on the right, but the purple bars represent horticulture, and interestingly enough, the growth in horticulture mirrors the growth for the wider agricultural sector. Another major challenge that I see for New Zealand, and unfortunately the Minister's not here to hear it, is that for 20 years at least, and perhaps longer, we have failed to invest enough in R&D in the science and the primary industry sector, and we are still doing that. And we cannot continue to expand internationally or to be a frontline agricultural nation unless we have research and development both at the background of that and at the forefront of those developments. Primary industries, 16% of the national spend in New Zealand, about half the OECD average, and way less than Australia. That is not sufficient, and we must, as a nation, do something about that. Despite my chairmanship of Solid Energy, where I get criticised for a lot of things, I consider myself a pretty committed environmentalist and somebody who actively operates at the farm level in the way we do things in an environmentally sustainable way. But when we see that 12% of the R&D spend is in the environment and 16% is in primary industry, it does question as to whether we do have the value equation right. The issue for governments is to ensure that we focus on the value to New Zealand rather than the political reaction of how we make those decisions. What we have here is something that reacts to popular trends, but it will be to the long-term detriment of the nation unless we increase the spend in the primary industry area. I want to now briefly deal with what I think are some of how we deal with some of those challenges. And I want to start with the typical Kiwi approach, particularly as we get into new markets in Asia, and to say that, in my view, the New Zealand approach, it's probably generous to say that it's haphazard. We do have very good entrepreneurial initiatives. We do have people with a lot of industry and endeavour and energy, but it is poorly coordinated, and that in these strongly emerging markets, that will ultimately be to our detriment. because we take the approach that we have a great product, we sometimes put it in great packaging, and then we go out to sell it. The Rabo board a couple of years ago had a presentation from the person who was then the president of McDonald's in China. That is not the approach that McDonald's use, despite the fact that they probably have the best acknowledged product in terms of market position anywhere in the world. What they do, and what we must do, is to research intensely the market, the factors in the market, the location issues, the dynamic, the changing demographics, and how and where they should promote themselves despite the fact that they have this fantastic product. That's what we have to do, and we've got to have emphasis on value chain and the pieces that are important. And for New Zealanders, historically, we have very poor emphasis on value chain scrutiny. So what I see that some of the actions that are needed is that we've got to change that position in this burgeoning market opportunity. If we believe the issue about global population, if we acknowledge that there is going to be a food shortage in Asia, and if we acknowledge that they can afford to pay for many of our products, then before we entrench ourselves in low leverage in those markets, I think that we've got to have a different approach. And that doesn't start with what we think is a fabulous product. It starts with understanding the market and the cost and value chains in the market and how they are changing. We need to understand the Asian ethnic and where and who and how you get the most leverage if you want to enter those markets. We need to accept that a random, undisciplined approach will be successful for individuals but significantly suboptimal for this industry and for New Zealand. We need to admit that most Asian nations are instinctively traders, that some of them have been trading for thousands of years and we're just starting, and so we should accept that they will be much smarter, much better prepared and much brighter, even though they appear to be much poorer. And we need to do all of this in a way that adds some value to those entrepreneurs who have already worn some of these paths and who should have an opportunity to increase their leverage and increase their market position. So my agenda for the horticultural industry, and specifically for Horticulture New Zealand, is to take a lead in achieving that. Because it's interesting when the Minister talked about primary industry partnerships and the opportunities, this agenda fits perfectly with that opportunity. And that rather than talk about the quality of our product and how we just simply grow more of it, we should start in the market, and I'm saying specifically China and the China regions, to understand supply and value chains in those markets. We should understand who makes the decisions, how decisions are made, what you've got to do to influence those decisions, and potentially where you can invest so you get some market leverage, which you will never get as an exporter in a suitcase based in Auckland or in Central Otago. That investigation, in my view, needs to be an economic one, but it needs to look specifically about distribution capability and developments. We know that infrastructure development is an issue in market access in those countries. So my question is, well, why don't we, as a horticultural industry, make sure there is some investment in those pieces that we can have some part of, that we can have some association with, that we can get some value out of, that will position us ahead of any other potential suppliers. We need to make sure that that analysis is done on country-specific value chain models, because what works in China won't necessarily work in Vietnam, which will be different from the way it operates in Malaysia and Indonesia, and all of those markets have potential. But what we need is the development of a New Zealand incorporated operational in-country capability to provide the infrastructure for New Zealand exporters, or who at that stage will be importers, that is not necessarily dominated totally by the operatives in those markets, who will take more share of the value chain increasingly unless we do something to protect it. We should, at the same time, in my view, we should develop revenue-specific goals about what we should achieve. And the question I would raise, heretically perhaps, is 10 billion the right number? Is it aspirational enough? If we think about the 70% requirement and the 25% land area, why can't it be bigger than that? What should the number be? And is it just a number plucked out of the air? It sounds aspirational today, but the issue that I'm talking about here is when we get a better understanding of those issues, we will have a better feel as to whether 10 billion is in fact the aspirational number that you think it is. And underlying it all will be this urgent domestic need for better science and education investment and focus in our industries. I'm delighted that the Minister for Tertiary Education has taken the very unpopular step recently of saying, in relation to engineering courses and graduates, that will be a priority, that instead of the market determining how people should enter university, there will be a bias towards engineering. I think that's long overdue. But that bias should include science as well, science and technology as well as engineering, and then I think would be on a much better track to helping solve some of these issues into the future. You might think that some of this is all a bit vague and beyond you as individual growers. One of the reasons why I've used this theme is certainly because we have good information from Rabobank and from our international research units that I think not enough people are aware of, and I think it provides the template for the discussion. But it came home to me in a discussion around a board table in Nelson last week in our apple business that I'm involved with, where there was discussion about how we might help each other as individual exporters. And it was the perfect example of the New Zealand problem. The discussion was well intended. The discussion was based on the tiny fraction of knowledge that we know and the tiny fraction of knowledge that somebody else knows, and putting those together that we'd be better off. Well, that's probably true. But that is not the answer. The answer is to start in this much more generic way in the market to understand what are the key drivers in those markets that we've got to attend to, because otherwise we will always be nickel and diming for the smaller piece of the value chain, and that the potential that the markets hold will go to somewhere else.